In this quick video, I'll walk you through step by step on how to connect your FastAPI application to a cloud RDS Postgres database. Now, RDS is a service on AWS, which is Amazon Web Service, the most popular cloud technology there is. This video is part of my best-selling AWS course where I walk you through how to deploy and create continuous integration and continuous delivery for a FastAPI and React full stack application. So if you want more information on that kind of stuff, the link to the course will be below. And with that, let's dive into this video. What is RDS in AWS? Well, RDS is an AWS core service. RDS stands for Relational Database Storage. It is a managed database service for using SQL. It allows you to create databases in the cloud and is managed by AWS. Since it's managed by AWS, that means they will handle all the provisioning, OS updates, can also do backups, replications, scalability, and more. And using RDS, this is how we're going to deploy our PostgreSQL database. So why use RDS? Well, AWS is handling the provisioning and OS updates, which keeps RDS secure. We could set up automatic backups, which we're not because it's not in the free tier. And we could also autoscale the size and resources while checking for monitoring and maintenance, replication, failover, and encryption. All of this makes RDS a great choice for our production database. What are some other options if we didn't want to use RDS? Well, if you didn't want AWS to handle your database infrastructure, you could create an EC2 like a virtual machine and then deploy your database on the EC2. This way you would have to handle all the upgrades yourself, handle all the security yourself, handle all the backups, the replication, the encryption. Well, all of this sounds like a lot of work, so let's stick with just using RDS. So how is this going to look once we implement RDS? Well, we know we already have our React application, which communicates to our backend application using HTTP. But instead of having SQLite 3 as our database, we are going to connect our application to AWS RDS with a PostgreSQL database. So after these next few videos, we will have our local application still running locally on your machine, but connected to an AWS database. All right, and now in this video, we are going to create our database in the cloud on AWS. Now, before we get started, there's over here where it says Ohio, US East Ohio. There's going to be a bunch of different regions that you can select from. I would recommend selecting the region, if it didn't already by default, of the region that is closest to you. That will create the best latency for you. However, if you want to make sure that everything in this course works exactly for you, go ahead and just click US East Ohio, no matter where you are in the world. Some things might take a little bit longer to get to you based on where you are, but that is okay. The latency won't be all that much for what we're trying to accomplish. Now, up here in the search bar, we can type in the service that we want to open, or we can click over here and say services, all services, and then find your services in this list. But I'm going to use a search bar and type in RDS. Now, RDS is the Relational Database Service. It allows us to be able to create databases in the cloud, and there's a bunch of different types of databases we can create. By default, we should see this DB instances that is 0 of 40. Let's go ahead and click that. Right here, we can see that we have no databases, and let's go ahead and say create database. Now, there's two different ways we can create this database. We can say standard create or easy create. Go ahead and keep it on standard create. Here we get to type our engine options. I'm going to say PostgreSQL. Keep scrolling down. Here we get to select our engine version. I would just use whatever's for default. And here we get to say production, dev test, or free tier. Make sure you click free tier. By default, it goes to production, which is a very, very strong database. If we scroll all the way to the bottom, we can see automatically it has a $1,477 USD for the starting database for production. We do not want that. We want the free tier. So make sure you select the free tier. Scroll down. Here we get to name our DB instance identifier. I'm going to name this FastAPI-AWS-database. Here we get to say whatever we want the master username to be. I'm going to say root user. Here we can say if we want the password to be managed in the AWS Secrets Manager or self-managed. I'm going to say self-managed and I'm going to type in a password. And if you've taken any of my previous courses, you know that my password is always test1234! Real quick, if you have enjoyed the video, please subscribe to be notified of upcoming videos and check out my best-selling FastAPI courses linked below. All right, so here we have our instance configuration. We can leave that alone. Storage, let's leave that alone. If you open up auto-scaling, we can see that we are on the free tier for our database. But if we exceed the free tier, we are allowing the database to scale for whatever we need it to do, which will cost money if you go outside the free tier. So I'm going to leave that okay. Here for the compute resource, we can say don't connect to an EC2 compute resource. Let's go ahead and keep that selected. Right here, we get to say our subnet group. Let's leave that default. Now here for public access, we need to make sure that we say yes here. This will allow us to be able to connect to our database from outside. And since our application is going to be starting off in local, connecting to our cloud RDS Postgres, we want to make sure that public access is yes. For VPC security group firewall, let's go ahead and say create new. And then here we get to name it whatever we would like. So I'm going to say FastAPI AWS Database VPC. Availability zone, no preference. And then we can just leave everything else as default. Now, when we get to monitoring, it'll say turn on performance insights. It's only a 7-day free trial. So I'm going to turn that off. And if we keep scrolling down, we can see that everything else is good. Now, when you get to the very bottom, it's going to say estimated monthly costs. We can see that the Amazon RDS free tier is available to you for 12 months. Each calendar month, the free tier will allow you to use the following resources, which is 750 hours. So what the free tier will allow you to do is have one database for free. If you create another database, it's going to go over that 750 hours. So if this is your only database, we're good to go. Say create database. You might get this pop-up window. Go ahead and just say close. And here we can see that our FastAPI AWS database is currently getting created. This is real time. We are creating a AWS database real time somewhere in the world in their data centers. Now, this can take anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes. So I'm going to stop the video here and I'll come back once this is done. All right, so here we need to configure our AWS database to our local project. So to connect to our RDS PostgreSQL database, now we want to connect our local FastAPI application to RDS. This is simply to test the connection before we deploy our FastAPI application. To do this, we need to create the connection string. So the connection string is going to be PostgreSQL : / the username for the database, the password, at the endpoint name, port name, /DB name. And you might be thinking, okay, where do we find all this information? Well, since we already have our PostgreSQL database deployed on RDS, the username can be found inside the RDS configuration, where you can see the master username is root user. Now, the password does not show by default. You need to remember your database password. As you can see, it's going to be asterisk when you look for it in the configuration. Now, for this example, we're going to say the password is test1234 ! So our string is going to be PostgreSQL : / root user : test1234 ! Now, the next things we need is our endpoint name, our port name, and our DB name. So the endpoint can be found inside RDS Connectivity and Security, where we can see our endpoint. The port can be found right underneath, and the database name by default is Postgres. So our port would be sitting right under endpoint, and our database name would be Postgres. So we can see that the entire thing would be Postgres : / root user : test1234 ! At our endpoint. Our port is 5432 with our name of our database, Postgres. So after our string is created, it should look like this. And what we can see is that we just filled in the username, password, endpoint, port name, and DB name with their values. And then after we have that string inside our FastAPI application, we need to make sure our create engine is going to be pointed to this URL. After this, we can see our application is going to be successfully connected to our RDS AWS database, and I will see you in the next video. All right, so now that we have our database created, we can see by saying available. Let's click into our database. And here we can see that it is publicly accessible. That is like the main thing. If that is no, make sure you come up here and say modify and change public accessible to yes. Now, one of the very first things that we need to do is right here under security where it says VPC security groups, go ahead and click that. Now inside our security groups, let's go ahead and click the check mark for our security group. Let's scroll down until you can see inbound rules. Click this one rule, and let's go ahead and say edit inbound rule. Here we can see that there is a custom source. What we want to do is change this to anywhere IPv4. This will allow our FastAPI application to be able to connect to this database. Let's now go down and click Save Rules. All right, now that that is done, let's go back up to our search bar and type in RDS. Go into our DB instances, go back to our FastAPI AWS database, and here's some things that we need to have. We need our endpoint, which is what our URL is to go connect to our application. Our port, which is 5432. And if we come over here and click configuration, we can see our root username is going to be our master username. And then our master password will not show. So you have to remember what that database password was that you set when you created this database. All right, so now that we have this created, let's go back into our application. All right, so if we look at our application so far, we have a FastAPI application with a virtual environment in a main.py file. Inside this main.py file, we have some FastAPI dependencies with SQL model and Unicorn. And if we scroll down, we can see the very first thing we have is a Postgres URL database inside RDS. And this is going to be creating a new SQL model table inside our RDS table called hero, where we pass in our SQL model and our table is true. So we're going to be creating a new table where our ID is optional and each hero is going to have a name and superpower. So the very first thing we're going to do is inside our virtual environment, or however you want to install the dependencies, we're going to say pip install FastAPI standard. Make sure you have these double quotation marks. And then we want to install SQL model, and then PSYCOPG2-binary. That's for connecting to a Postgres database. Even though it's on RDS, we need to connect to a Postgres database. All right, so after we get these dependencies installed, these yellow lines should just go away here in a second. All right, there it goes. And now we need to connect to our Postgres database. It says SQLite right here. Let's go ahead and change this to PostgreSQL. All right, so we need to connect to our Postgres database. We need to instantiate. So right here, we are calling this create DB in tables on our lifespan of our FastAPI application. So on start, we go ahead and create the tables based on SQL model. And then inside here, we are able to create a hero, fetch all heroes, and then delete a hero. So what we need to do here is pass in our PostgreSQL : username and password, but it's separated by a colon. Then we need to paste in the path to our FastAPI application. Let's go over to connectivity and security, and let's copy this endpoint. Let's go back to our code and just paste it in right here. Next, we need to pass in the port, which is 5432. You can identify your port right under your endpoint right here where it says port 5432. And then we need to add the database name, which by default is Postgres. And this URL does not exist unless you are in my AWS account, and I'm going to be deleting this database afterwards. So make sure that you are pasting in your RDS URL. And then from here, we are going to have our engine just be able to create our engine where we pass in this new Postgres database into here, and then echo equals true is a SQL model thing, which it'll print the SQL query in our console when we run our application. And then from here, we have our heroes endpoints. All right, let's go ahead and say FastAPI dev main.py. That'll start up our application. Let's go ahead and go in our web browser. Going to refresh the page. And here we can see all three of our endpoints. I'm going to start by creating a new hero. Since ID is optional, make sure you remove that ID. If not, you're going to save the ID as 0. Here, I'm going to say name is Superman. And we're going to say his superpower is just to fly right now. I know he has way more powers than that. Execute, we get a 200. And then we can do another one like Spider-Man. And he shoots webs. If we execute that, a superpower, name, and ID. If we come up here, we can say try it out, execute. We have 2 users now in our RDS database. And if we want to delete superhero 1, We'll get hero deleted successfully, and then we can say execute, and we can see that that user was removed. All right, now let's go back into our AWS browser, and we refresh the screen. We can see that this database is now currently active. Before it was saying 0 connections, and now it's going to say current activity. And that's because we really have our application connected to our FastAPI AWS database.